Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We have been up to a lot over the week. We appeared on the Miami Heat Zone podcast as guests once again. Please check out that video. It will be in the description. We talked Jimmy Butler, the Heat's roster, and plus, a little bit of NBA Finals preview. So please check that out. And if you came from the Miami Heat Zone podcast, welcome. We hope you guys do stick around. We've seen that we've got a few subscribers. So, once again, welcome. And we do have a comment from at the kid always on YouTube. This is in regards to our YouTube short. He said, even though I am not a fan of the Mavs, but I think they might shock everyone by winning it all. It reminds me of my high school years when the Rockets won the 1995 title by shocking everyone. I hope I am wrong because I grew up on the Northeast and will always bleed green. The 90s were not good for the Celtics, though. Then again, it wasn't good for anyone not named the Bulls. I think that's historically true, historically factual, obviously, and I think it makes a whole lot of sense. There is like a pathway for the Mavs to win. We mapped that out, a little bit and gave them a roadmap to succeed and win the chip in our last episode. And I think it all starts with Luka being the best player on the floor.
Yeah, exactly. And, again, also, Kyrie's going to be a big factor, too, because if he can be one of the three best players, that's kind of Dallas's pathway in addition to the very high level defense they've been able to play. And, with the reference to the Rockets, yeah, I believe the Rockets in their two titles, I think both times they were the lower seed. They were actually the sixth seed in 1995. And I think they started the year off pretty poorly, and they went against Shaq's Orlando Magic, and that team won, almost 60 games, and they also knocked off the Chicago Bulls when they played them in the playoffs right after Jordan had come back from his first retirement. So, and I guess this is a situation where, like, it's a little bit different, because I think at the time Olajuwon was still viewed as the better player compared to Shaq, but Shaq was still really good, in comparison, like with Dallas, like a lot of people feel like Luka's the best player, even though they're not looked at as the best team. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting. Well, I guess you could say that about Houston as well, but either way, different time. But I think that is a fair comparison, and it is interesting, right? That a Celtics fan, right? This is somebody that isn't super confident in their team's ability to win the title, which, I guess, they've made a lot of deep playoff runs, but they haven't been able to get over the hump. And I guess, that fear, right, is kind of where things are coming from. But at a certain point, usually if you've got it, you can overcome it, right? Like, say, it's a different scenario, right? But like, say, LeBron with the Heat, right? The first year against the Mavs, he was not very good, right? And then the following year, right, he ended up making up for that in a big way against OKC, and then did it again against the Spurs. So you just never know. Not comparing Jason Tatum to LeBron, obviously, but we're just as a comparison of, you don't want to write off what a team can do or what somebody's going to do in their career when they're not even 30 yet.
Yeah, that's the blueprint for sure. And
Mhm.
before we do
Same
get
with
started,
Luka if
what's up?
they lose.
Yeah,
Same with
exactly.
Luka if they lose. I wouldn't write off Dallas's ability or Luka's ability to win
No,
a title.
expect them to come back stronger. That's how it normally goes. But before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for a chance for your comment to be read, just like that. And for more content and updates.
Yeah, so obviously we're, only a few days away if you're watching this on Monday, right? Game 1 will be Thursday, right? Game 1 between the Boston Celtics and the Dallas Mavericks, right? Obviously, it's in Boston. They have home court, right? According to, a lot of the odds, right? They are 6.5 point favorites, right? Because, and again, we are not Vegas bettors. We don't offer betting advice, right? We're just looking at that. So that's, kind of a, relatively decent, view of like, yeah, they should win, which makes sense. And I think also, it sounds like Porzingis is going to play in game 1, right? So I think that's the other factor as well. So I think, when we kind of break down, this game 1, right? And we already kind of talked about the series, I think it's kind of not that it's simple, but I think if you're Dallas, I think you need to win game 1 if you want to win the series. Like,
Mhm.
not that the series is over if you lose game 1, because I mean you could win game 2. But I think ideally, as we've talked about before, in prior postseasons with teams, if you can win that first game on the road, that's always the most ideal scenario to pull off the upset, because then worst case scenario, you go back home with the series tie, right? As opposed to, yeah, you could win game 2, even if you lose game 1, but if you end up losing game 2, right? Then you're going back home with down 0-2, right? So like you'd rather win game one with a worst case scenario being a split than lose game one with a worst case scenario being down 0-2 and the series more than likely probably being over. Not that it's completely over, but I think if you're Boston, I think you can lose this game and still win the series. I think if you're Dallas, I think it's a little bit more difficult. Again, not impossible, but I just think if you're Dallas, especially with the fact that Porzingis is coming back and he hasn't played in over a month, I think it would be ideal if you're Dallas to kind of pull off the upset in game one, because then he kind of comes in and changes the rotations up a little bit and maybe throws people's minutes and, equilibrium's off balance. So I think if you're the Mavs, I think this is kind of the best chance to win the series is to win this first game. And I think in order to win it, obviously you're going to need strong performances from Luca and Kyrie on offense, and they're going to have to find ways to slow down, you know, Tatum and Brown, and then maybe find some way to kind of slow down the role players. Maybe there's a way where, let's say at the start of the game, it may not be Tatum and Brown that guard Luca and Kyrie. It might be, Derek White and Drew Holiday. But if Luca and Kyrie kind of put the pressure on the Boston guards early in the game, maybe that kind of puts those guys in a position where maybe their offense is a little bit harder to come by because they might be a little bit more fatigued guarding those two players, right? Obviously, if you can make Tatum and Brown work, right? Because then that process for Boston may be a little bit more difficult because then the role players can't do their thing. So, I think that's kind of the path, if you're Dallas, right? I think if you're Boston, I think it's just kind of business as usual as it's been for, the previous rounds, right? Except obviously, you're playing against, more high level talent than you were the earlier rounds, right? Where it's just, you can play your game, you create, good looks, right? Tatum and Brown can do their thing, one on one and spread the ball, attack mismatches as you and I have highlighted multiple times, right? Porzingis, if you can get him in the post, or have him, roll out to the 3-point line. I don't know if I can expect as many lobs since he's been out. Maybe it happens, but um, and then if you can get, some contributions from your bench, right? I don't know if they're starting Porzingis or if they're just, or if they're going to have him, initially come off the bench. I don't know. But, whatever happens, I think if you can get some contributions from that second unit, right? I think that obviously will help as well, right? Like Peyton Pritchard's been pretty solid.
Yeah.
Even though, Hauser's kind of slowed down in terms of shooting, but, if either Porzingis or Horford is in the second unit, that's pretty cool. So I think, for Missoula, right? If assuming Porzingis plays, right, just going back to having the right mix of guys, right? And again, these guys playing their games, that's kind of the best roadmap for Boston, right? Again, if Tatum and Brown are two of the three best players, right, then that makes it more likely that they'll win. If they can find a way to kind of slow down Kyrie and make him, a little closer to what he was doing against OKC, where he was a little bit more quiet in some of those games, then that's, Boston's pathway to win. Because we know like Luka's the best player for Dallas, and he's not very easy to stop. But I think if you can kind of shut down Kyrie, that's another way because we talked about it where it's like making Luka and Kyrie work on defense. But another way to probably make them, work a little bit harder even on offense is if you're, Boston and you can kind of take Kyrie out of it. Because then that forces Luka to not be able to kind of just sit back for possessions and let Kyrie do his thing. Then he's going to have to do more on offense. And then presumably if he does even more on offense, then maybe that might, kind of limit what he can do defensively. But I think that's kind of for both of those teams, your pathways to win, game one. I think Dallas needs game one more than Boston does. But I think, if you're Boston, you don't want to lose it. But like I said, I think Dallas, if you want to win the series, you need to steal this game.
Yeah. And now that we know Porzingis is coming back, he's a 20-point scorer, 20 points per game guy. So add that back into the lineup, and it's a
Rim
different
protection too.
Boston. What'd you say?
Rim protection too.
Exactly, because I think he averaged 2 blocks a game as well. So, that's going to be crucial, especially if you're going up against Dallas, because I think one of the top storylines outside of Porzingis and him returning is for sure, the fact that the battle of the backcourts is going to be a big deal because, you're not just dealing with, two slouches on defense. Like, this is Drew Holiday and Derek White. We're both,
Hmm.
all defensive team guys. They both got on the second team, I believe, this year.
Yep.
So, that's a big deal. But for keys to victory, I think for Boston, you're going to need to be able to hit your threes, but you're also going to need to be able to take away the three. And I think, they're primed to do that. I don't want to get too analytical or anything like that. But, the Mavs, they like to win by, kind of banking on that corner three. Obviously, Luka, Kyrie, they're going to get their shots from all over the place. But PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr., they make the majority of their threes from the corner. And they've made around a little over 4.5 corner 3-pointers a game. So that's the most in the playoffs by a huge margin. But the Celtics defense, that's the awesome part about this matchup is they don't yield a lot of corner threes. They only yield about 1.5. So expect them to take away that corner three, which is something that I don't think any team has been able to do
Hmm.
against Dallas so far. Because you look at the other matchups where OKC they were literally giving PJ Washington and Derek Jones Jr. those threes as well as Minnesota for a lot of times as well.
Right.
So I think the only team that potentially took that away was probably the Clippers. I think they did a good job at that, kind of limiting what the Wings were able to do. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a freaking bloodbath, I think, because both these teams, there is a recipe for both of them to kind of beat each other out. It's just a matter of
Right.
who's going to execute more. Because I just don't foresee like guys like Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, over helping and kind of giving up threes to PJ Washington. And that's their defensive identity. Like they don't allow corner threes. They don't really allow a lot of easy buckets. But I
Yeah.
think the Celtics, they're going to attack with the three ball, which they should. And I think Porzingis, he's a better, more efficient, more reliable option offensively than Al Horford. I think even like hobbled, I think he's better than Al Horford. So I'm kind of expecting them to open up the floor, run a lot of 5 out, and then as the threes fall, as they kind of force Dallas to respect that 3-point option, then you're going to see probably Jason Tatum, more so Jaylen Brown. I think go and attack downhill. And like you were talking about, we don't know what kind of state Porzingis is going to be. Is he going to be in a state where he can actually catch lobs? Who knows? Because we don't want him to have like a Joel Embiid kind of thing where he goes up for a crazy athletic play, comes down hard, and then he's hurt, and then the series might be in question. Um, but yeah, I'm expecting them to run a huge 5 out set, and then open up the floor for everybody else, which is kind of what we talked about already. Hunt the mismatches. That's what they're going to do. Move the ball. And defensively, I think is where they're really going to shine because you're going to see, okay, we're going to put all our pressure on everybody, because we're not a slouch team where, we're not just focused on two guys. We're focused on everybody.
And then, for Dallas, their defense obviously is going to be really important
Mm-hmm.
as well, right? Because, even a guy like a Kyrie, he's been better defensively this postseason than I think, you would expect given his reputation as a defender, right? And that's something, you know, that it's going to be interesting. It like to say, like, say he gets switched on to, either Tatum or Brown or somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can he kind of hold his own, in a way where like maybe, he, kind of finds a way to get some deflections or steals, or something like that? Because, if he can kind of create some possible transition opportunities for Dallas, right, that could be big time, right? And then obviously for Dallas, right, like they like to protect the rim, right? So, but for Boston, they can attack and score at the rim, but like you said, they also can spread you out to the 3-point line. So that means that again, Dallas is going to have to do a good job of not allowing people to just get open threes because Boston doesn't have a guy that you can cheat off of, on offense where you can kind of just okay, we're okay with giving that guy an open shot, right?
You could bait and bank
Like
on it, but that's a gamble.
yeah, right, exactly. Like maybe like somebody might be like, well, let's see if Drew Holiday can actually, hit some shots. But he shot pretty well from three this year,
Right.
right? I think in the postseason it might be a little bit less, but but that's because it was so high during the regular season. I think he shot like 44%
Yeah.
from three.
And he makes up
So,
for it,
that
on defense as well.
exactly. So, and that's, and again, that's the thing where it's like, you know, say with Minnesota, right? You had to kind of have Anthony Edwards guard, one of Kyrie or Luca for the vast majority of the game. But you don't have to have Tatum or Brown guard those two guys for the vast majority of the game. They can guard them in spots or spurts, maybe to close, but there you can have long stretches where it's like I said, it's White or Holiday. So that's going to be really intriguing to see because that's where again we already know what Boston can do defensively, but again, I think people are starting to get more and more impressed by what the Mavs can do defensively. It's just again with Minnesota, there's more guys that you can kind of be okay with cheating off of, or guys that you're just not worried about taking guys off the dribble, like you said in the live stream and in the last recording, right? Like a guy like a Jaden McDaniels, right? Is not a guy that's going to really make somebody work defensively,
Right.
right? Because he's not a guy that really creates a lot of his own offense,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's mainly like, either threes or, offensive boards or cuts or, it's not a guy that creates his own offense. But
Mm-hmm.
with Boston, pretty much any guy in the starting five, can at least to some extent, create their own shots,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like obviously even a Porzingis, if you give him the ball in the post, right, that kind of counts as being able to create some shots. You have to give it to him, but he can still create some offense there. So that's something that I think Dallas is going to have to figure out because again, the previous teams that they faced, right? Clippers with Kawhi that barely played, obviously Oklahoma City, right? Oklahoma City you could possibly say maybe the closest thing to a team like a Boston, right? But obviously it's a different team because
Mhm.
those guys don't have as much experience, and they're other than Shea, they're not quite in that same tier, right? Like there's not somebody that's Jalen Brown's level at this point in their careers yet in the playoffs, right? Compared to the regular season, or even like a Chet, right? Is can do some things like Porzingis can, right? Where he can shoot, he can block shots, but he doesn't have the same level of he can kind of post up and back a guy down and he's not, and Porzingis is a lot stronger as well. So, and also Chet couldn't hit threes in that series against the Mavs. So, assuming Porzingis can, and that's the thing with Boston. Like, if their threes go in at a pretty good rate, then it may just be really difficult for Dallas, right? Because we know that Boston can defend anyways. So, if the 3-point shooting continues, which it seems like it has so far for the majority of the postseason, again, it's going to be a difficult task for Dallas, even with the acknowledgement that I think everybody understands that they do have the best player on the floor. It's just a matter of, again, you know, is he limited in any way? Not necessarily like physically, because we know he's playing through something, but like if Boston can at least make him work, right? Where he's not just kind of able to kind of just score it well. And it may not matter, right? Because we've seen, times where you could have a great defensive player guard a guy and it just doesn't matter, right? Like the Celtics know this well because Marcus Smart was the defensive player of the year. And there were stretches in that series where he couldn't, do anything against Steph. And that's not because it's Marcus Smart, but that's because of how good Steph is, right? Like we saw Jokic in game 5 against Rudy Gobert, where it's
Mhm.
like, if you look at those clips, it's not like Gobert is playing terrible defense,
Sure.
right? But Jokic is just cooking him one on one. And that's what Luca can do, right? Like if he's in the pick and roll or if he's in one on one situations, he can also post up. That's another factor too. But Boston, their guards are relatively strong. So it's not, so like if he backs down a Drew Holiday may not necessarily give ground, but Luca may also not care that Drew Holiday's guarding him. So that's another factor as well. Because we know that, great offensive players sometimes can just destroy guys, even guys that are elite defensive players. And I think that's where, people who think that the Mavs can win, that's where some of that, probably comes from is that they feel like even with as great defensively as Boston is, they may not be able to slow down Luca and Kyrie in a way that allows them to win the series. Because again, it's not about making them, have horrible series. It's just about they can't be great.
Yeah. And it's like, and I think that brings up kind of like a question I wanted to pose about game one was, which duo do you think is going to look better in game one? Do you think, we're going to get a better Luca Kyrie game or are we looking, more so Tatum and Brown? Because I think, you have to look at this, for objectively and you have to look at it obviously statistically as well. Because the trend for, Tatum and Brown is, they've been stellar doing everything else but pretty much 3-point shooting, which is
Yeah.
part of the core identity. I guess, Brown has looked pretty good, from 3-pointer, 37%. That's actually pretty good. But Tatum
Yeah.
specifically has been 29% from the postseason from three,
Mhm.
which is, I think a little subpar considering his
Right.
standards and, where you would rank him currently. But, Brown has, been on fire. He's been shooting like 54% from the
Yep.
field in this
Yeah.
postseason. He's arguably been better than Jason Tatum. But I think Tatum's been better all around. But
Yeah.
offensively, I think you look at Jaylen Brown, you're like, okay, he's the guy because he's able to get so downhill, and he's also just a little bit more efficient at that. Um,
Right.
but it's a part of their identity. So them struggling with a part of their identity, do you think that kind of makes a difference in game one, or do you think they're gonna kind of set the tone, come out sparking threes? Like, what are your predictions, kind of for just the
Feel like
duos? I'm not talking like the entire teams,
yeah.
just the duos though.
I feel like for Boston, I think it's more likely that they could still win a game with one of them not being as good on offense
Sure.
because they have so many other guys that can help out, relatively consistently on offense that it may not matter. Whereas like it may be a little bit tougher. Like say and again it's a different team, but like say like Luca and Kyrie basically gave you 30 each, like every game against Minnesota. And the one game that they didn't was the game that they lost, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, but that's the thing is that they've been great basically almost every game. But again, Boston, I do feel like is a different team. I'm just curious as to what Dallas does in terms of who they're putting on Tatum and Brown, right? Like, do you have PJ Washington on Tatum and Derek Jones Jr. on Brown, or do you switch it and you have Derek Jones Jr. on Tatum and PJ Washington on Brown? That's kind of, what I'm interested to see. And those guys in Brown and Jones, right? They're good athletes. They can move their feet, and they can switch anyway. So, so you're not necessarily concerned about that. But, I'm not sure because again, I mean, it's in Boston, and Boston had, the only two games that they've lost in the playoffs were in Boston. But at the same time, both Brown and Tatum, like you said, have been good all postseason. So I'm not sure. That's a tough one. I feel like they could probably be relatively even, but I think it comes down to maybe some of the role players, right? Like like if let's say like both guys or all four of them kind of play each other to about a draw. Like obviously Tatum and Brown are the better defenders, but offensively they could fight to a draw. But then if you get, a hot PJ Washington game and Derek Jones Jr. game, but maybe like White and Holiday are a little bit cold, right? That could possibly be the difference, right? If this is a close game, and then obviously you can flip it, right? Where if Washington and Derek Jones stink, right? Or if somebody off the bench doesn't really give you much, like, let's say like if a Lively, just maybe like the stage is too much for him and he doesn't play as well, or something like that. Not saying that that's going to happen, but that's why I think it may come down more so to the role players because I feel like that those four guys could play each other to a relative draw.
Okay. I mean that's fair, 100%. Because my worry is, for our pick in Boston is if these games are close, do I trust Tatum? Like, being real, because I think all season we've kind of seen him struggle. He's made some very bad errors in the fourth quarter, even in the postseason, where it's like, okay, what were you doing? Trying to do a little bit too much. But Jalen
Mhm.
Brown has kind of been there to pick up the slack.
Y-
The plus side is, if it comes to overtime, Tatum kind of picks it up because I think
Right.
there's a little bit less pressure with that, involved, and you're more so free to kind of play your game versus, maybe like the final minute or so of a game.
Right. I
So
think,
that's my worry. Like if it's
yeah,
close, I think you kind of feel like Kyrie and Luca have the edge because they're both bona fide closers, whereas with Boston, you might have Jalen Brown, and that's about it in terms of closing.
right. Because I think maybe, kind of what you're hinting at is the fact that, well, a lot of the Indiana games were close, but you can kind of deal with that being a close game because you're not really concerned about Indiana necessarily, being
Exactly.
able to kind of slow you down on the defensive end,
Exactly.
right? And also just because of Indiana's relative lack of inexperience, right? You don't like we saw in all those games, right? Like game 1 is the one where like that absolutely should have been an Indiana win because of the timeout, but
Yep.
you could say like yeah, games 3 and 4, like, like you could flip it and maybe Indiana does something but Boston could still win, right? Like cuz in those games like, they ended up being able to pull it out. But, the thing against Dallas is Dallas may be less likely to make those type of bad mistakes that Indiana would.
Sure.
And that's where I think, like what you're saying is if it's a close game, then you may feel more comfortable about Dallas because we know even if guys guard Luca and Kyrie perfectly, they could still score, right? Whereas say, in with Indiana, right? Halliburton didn't play in the last couple of games. So now you're kind of banking on, either Andrew Nemhart or Pascal Siakam without Tyrese Halliburton to kind of close the game out for you. Or say in Cleveland's case, right? It was Mitchell was out the last couple of games. So it's like Darius Garland, Max Struess, Evan Mobley. And then obviously with the Heat, right? I mean, none of those games except I think for game 2 was close, right? But it was like Bam, Hero, Jaquez, or whatever. So I think that's the difference here, where if you're Dallas, if you can just get it close, right? Then that's where you should feel decent, right? Because like against Minnesota, right? Like there were stretches where Minnesota had big leads, and then Dallas was able to get back in because of the droughts that Minnesota would have offensively. It's just again, do we expect Boston to have as many offensive droughts given the fact that they have just a better collection of offensive players?
Not unless
You
it's
know,
close, and Tatum is the guy trying to take those,
right?
game clinching, tying shots, whatever you want
Because
to
the
call it.
droughts could come like if it's a stretch where like nobody's getting to the basket, like if Dallas just completely shuts off their ability to get to the rim, and then it just turns into like a 3-point chuck fest, right? And maybe like as the pressure mounts or as fatigue sets in, maybe those shots start to that were going in that were swishes start to be short misses or rim outs or whatever.
Right.
But I don't know, like it's just Offensively, Boston is a different challenge, I think, than Minnesota because Boston, I mean, it's a better team first off, but also it's a
Yeah,
way better offensive team, right?
yeah,
And it's like what we talked about in the previous discussions where like Minnesota statistically was the better defense, but Boston defensively should be able to do more stuff, like with switching or, just matchups in general. Like it's not a scenario where you're going to have, like a super tiny point guard other than Peyton Pritchard, switched on to, like a big guard or you're not going to have as many situations where it's a super slow super clunky center, right, trying to stay in front of like Kyrie Irving or something like that. Like obviously they have Horford and Porzingis, but they also have other guys that can help, so it's not the same as Minnesota.
yeah. And I think another factor for game one is going to be foul trouble. What does the foul trouble look like, and who's going to kind of rotate in if certain guys get into foul trouble? Because I think that's going to be an intriguing part. Because I think you look at Derek Jones Jr., you look at PJ Washington. If either of those guys get into foul trouble, you're bringing in what, Josh Green, and Dante Exum probably to rotate in potentially on the defensive end, and then they're probably going to have to take the assignment of Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown, and then that's that could trickle down to Luka getting into foul trouble. It could just be a whole big mess, and on both ends too, because if Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown get into foul trouble, that I think kind of plays into what our initial gripe was with Boston at the beginning of the season was, okay, well, where's the wing depth? Because then you're going to
Right.
have to bring in like what, Sam Hauser, who's been good defensively, but still, I think you're going to take a hit on offense, and the fluidity of your offense is going to take a hit. And then you'd have to probably bring in like a guy like Luke Cornett. There's just a bunch of guys that you probably just wouldn't want to play um, a whole lot of minutes if the foul trouble, gets to the Stars.
Right, and then also, like, even with the foul trouble, right? Like Boston is a team that doesn't really foul a lot
Yep.
anyways, right? Because again, they have a lot of really good defenders that don't, commit a lot of silly, senseless fouls. And Dallas is a team where, you have a couple of guys like say like a Luka, right, who can get to the free throw line a ton, right? So that's going to be important for Boston, right? Is, can they guard Luka without fouling? So that way, it kind of ends up being these possessions where he's forced into taking a tough shot, right? As opposed to kind of being bailed out by the defense, like we saw, against Minnesota, where Minnesota does foul a lot. And it's like, sometimes it's these silly, senseless fouls where it's like, the bigs trying to pick them up, from 70 feet or whatever. Or, Jaden McDaniels kind of, falling for the Luca pump fakes, or just kind of making like silly mistakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mistakes that if Boston is disciplined, right, shouldn't happen, right? Because we know again Boston doesn't normally foul a lot, and I mean then also like can Boston kind of flip it and kind of get to the line, you know, at all, right? Because
Yeah.
obviously they have guys that can get to the free throw line, and like you said, but if they can put some of those guys in foul trouble, right, that could help. Like you said, if a guy like a PJ Washington has to pick up a few early fouls because he's trying to guard Tatum or Brown driving to the basket, right, then that forces Dallas into playing somebody else,
Right.
right? That may not be quite as helpful in that specific spot of the game.
Right.
So, that's something to kind of keep in mind. And obviously for Boston, right, like, again, you need most of your guys, available, right? Like you don't want a scenario where like Tatum or Brown is in foul trouble and then you have to replace them with, like Sam Hauser or, some other forward,
Yeah.
which, again, not, and again, like with those guys, like they're not going to pull Tatum or Brown unless they have like 3 fouls, like in the first quarter or something
Exactly.
like that,
That's what I
right?
was
Like,
really hinting at.
yeah, because usually like with the Stars, like normally you kind of trust that they don't pick up, a silly, senseless foul, right? Like, like especially, because especially if it's not a big man, because usually like, say like with a guard, like you just shouldn't be picking up like a bunch of fouls, early in the game. Because like, a lot of times, like, in Boston's case, it's different because they're all defensive guards. But say like Luka or Kyrie, they probably shouldn't pick up, 3 fouls in the first quarter because they're not going to be guarding, the other team's best offensive players, right? But if they
Right.
do get into foul trouble, then that's obviously going to be difficult. Because I think in the first round, I think Luca and Kyrie at different times got into foul trouble against the Clippers. But is that going to happen against Boston as much? You know, Given how many times Boston will take three, maybe not.
Right. Well, I
Oh,
mean, I agree. Sorry, I was on my phone. I had to respond to a text real quick. Um,
mhm,
yeah, I mean, overall, I think game one is going to be, the tone setter. I think we've talked about that multiple times. There's a
mhm,
lot riding on this. We've already kind of talked about it. Regular season, Luka has torched the Celtics with them being fully healthy. But then Kyrie's bringing in that extra motivation, playing against Boston as well. And then,
Hmm.
from Boston's perspective, this is the year. This is the bounce back after the horrible, Tatum series, Tatum finals, and even Jaylen Brown. I don't think Jaylen Brown was all that great in that finals either, but, against the Warriors. But, they're back. They bounced back in a huge way. They made the improvements to get back here. This is what you wanted if you're a Boston fan. And then obviously Porzingis has that extra motivation, playing against his
Right.
former team as well. So I think, the tempers will be flaring, which is
Mhm.
good. I think that's always a good thing, especially, when you're on the biggest stage of the world for basketball, that is. And, it's going to be insane because I think there's going to be a lot of guys that'll probably elevate their play. Like I'm even looking at Drew Holiday. We've seen him in the finals before, and he put on an insane clinic. Against the Suns and Devin Booker, and what he was able to do, getting stops like that. I'm kind of expecting him to kind of turn back the clock and replicate that a little bit. I think we're going to see a lot of plays where you're like, whoa, didn't know he still had that in him.
Right.
And I think
Right.
that goes for pretty much every single player on this team. Who's a little
Mhm.
bit up there in age. Probably some Al Horford moments where you're like, okay, there's that hustle, his ability
Yeah.
to potentially, get a sneaky athletic play. And then Kyrie, obviously, probably going to turn back the clock. We're probably going to see some clutch moments from him throughout the
Yeah.
series. But game one's going to be amazing, I think.
So I guess, if we could take like the three most interesting storylines,
Mm,
in this finals, right? You know, from, third to first, right? What would they necessarily be, I guess?
okay. I would say Luca getting his first ring is probably number one. I
Okay.
think that's kind of been the number one thing that people have been talking about. People have been, wondering when that's going to be. Is it going to be early? Is it going to be later in his career? So I think that's
Right.
number one. Number two, I think obviously is going to be Jason Tatum as well from that perspective, but I think people care about Luca more so um, because we've already talked about it. Jason Tatum is probably in a lose-lose situation where if he wins, it's going to be like, okay, he had a Mickey Mouse run, yada yada yada. But if he loses, it's like you had the best team in the NBA and you still couldn't win the finals.
Right.
So I think it's going to mean a lot for him if he wins the finals, along with Jaylen Brown as well, because then that completely validates going all in and keeping these two guys together. Because there's been a lot of question marks about their chemistry, what they look like in previous playoff runs, and was it really worth it paying all these guys all this money and then bringing in other additions like Porzingis and Drew Holiday? But they went all in and they're here again. And then my final one would probably be Kyrie returning to Boston. I think
Yeah.
you can't ignore that one. That's a huge one, especially considering what was going on in Kyrie's life. He's talked about it. He's opened up. He's had, I think he had passings in his family during that time. The media, the scrutiny, it was a lot. Trying to kind of get away from LeBron's shadow, I guess, is if that's what you want to call it. There's a lot of pressure. That was such an awkward time, I think, for him. So this is going to be a big deal for him. He's not. I don't expect him to, revert back to the immature ways where he's stomping and disrespecting the logo. But I think you're probably going to see him disrespecting the fans as they will disrespect him for sure. But I think that's going to kind of translate into his play, where you're going to see him pulling off some stuff that you're like, oh wow, like this guy
Yeah.
is like the best ball handler of all time.
Yeah, I think the order that you had, I think that's pretty much spot on, right?
Okay,
Because like you said, I think like you said, the most interesting I think angle is the Luca first ring. Where does he kind of go into? What ceiling does he kind of enter? In terms of like NBA lore or whatever you want to call it, right?
yeah,
Exactly. And then also just again, kind of just the factor of like the best player in the world title, right? Could that possibly be up for grabs? If he gets that title. Not saying it is, but
I
I
think
think
it
there's
would
going
be.
to be a lot of people that will make the case, for that, right?
I
So
think
that's going to
so.
be something to kind of, look at. And then, like you said, with Tatum and Brown, that's the other factor, right? Because as you mentioned, that's a group that's been together for quite a while, right? And they've been to the Eastern Conference Finals for the most part every year, aside from maybe like one or two seasons that they've been together, right? Obviously, they went to the finals a couple years back, right? Didn't work out, right? Maybe he thought that they would get back to it. Didn't work out again, went down 3-0. And then, like you said, they went all in, right? And somehow were able to get two all-star caliber talents for, guys that aren't necessarily all-stars. Um, and then obviously, right now they have a chance to kind of, like you said, validate that pairing because we never thought it, but they're we're I guess kind of some people, right? Kind of covering the NBA that kind of hinted at the idea of like, yeah, there might be a point where you may have to break them up, and
Hmm.
maybe that at some point has to happen like because of the cap or whatever right down the road. But obviously, if you win, right, then you kind of do everything you can to keep them together,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, that's obviously the big factor. And then like Kyrie, right, like you said, his stock obviously, which is already I think high amongst a lot of NBA fans and people, like players around the league, anyways, right? But then it goes up another level, right? Because then it's like, wow, you were, one of the most important parts of like, two big time players championship runs. And especially for him, right? Like you said, there was a stretch where his stock was very low, right? Where, a lot of people were like, not that, he couldn't play, but just the fact that was he going to play? And then, how reliable was he going to be and all the other off the court stuff, right? But, to have an opportunity to possibly bounce back and basically help deliver another team an NBA title, I think would do a lot, in terms of like, where, he would end up being, right? Because he wasn't on the 75 greatest all time list, I don't
Yeah.
think at all, right? Yeah, he was left off the list,
Which is
right? But
insane. And another
right, but
honorable mention, I would say, is probably,
mhm.
I think, if Kyrie and Luca win a ring together, I think that also puts them in a different conversation
Right.
duo wise already, which is
Yeah,
insane in their second season together. But there's already
right.
been talks about, them being the most skilled backcourt of all time.
Yeah,
So
because
if they do win that ring, I think, there is a conversation to be had.
right, yeah, I think, then the question becomes, at least for the current, discussions, right? Like, are they the best duo in the NBA, right? Because, there've kind of been over the last several years, right, like a number of, people that have had that, duos that have had that mantle, right? At different points, right? Like some people said Paul George and Kawhi or LeBron and AD or, obviously, Jokic and Murray, right? And others, right? Tatum and Brown, right? And then I guess, if the Celtics win, right, maybe some people might say it's them, you know, and maybe like the Jokic Murray pairing, right? Maybe that has to be kind of changed a little bit, right? Just because Murray's not quite in that tier as some of the other guys. But then, like you said, if Dallas wins, right, then you're going to have a lot of people that say like, "Oh, Luca and Kyrie, now they're the best duo, in the NBA," or at least they'll have the belt, and then somebody will have to take it from them,
Yeah.
over the course of next season, right? And then obviously, like again, smaller ish narratives, like you said, honorable mentions, right? Like Horford getting his first ring right after playing in a ton of playoff games,
Sure.
but not having, but not being able to be on a team that was able to win the title, aside from the last couple of seasons. And then obviously, you kind of, look around even the coaches, right? Like Joe Mazzulla, right? Like he was just kind of elevated, a year ago from an assistant to the head coach, right? And now he's basically the coach of the future, at least for now, of course. Um, Obviously he's not going anywhere, right? And then Jason Kidd, right? Came into coaching right after being retired, right? And initially was kind of looked at as not being that good, right?
Yeah.
But then obviously in Dallas,
Where
he's
was
been
he in
able to flip
Milwaukee?
that. He was in Brooklyn first.
Brooklyn. Okay.
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
He was in Brooklyn first, then Milwaukee.
Okay.
And then after Milwaukee, right? Then he was an assistant for the Lakers.
Yeah.
Then after that, he got the head coaching gig for the
Yeah.
Mavs, right? And that would also be interesting for him because it would be a title for the same team, one as a player and one as a coach, right?
Yeah.
Which
That's
just
awesome.
that doesn't, yeah, which that hasn't been the case for a long time, I don't think,
Was
right?
it Bill
So
Russell?
yeah, I mean, yeah, and that was a long time ago. So
Very long time ago, man.
I think Casey Jones, I think was the coach of maybe like some of the Bird Celtics teams.
Okay.
So that's another factor as well. But either way, those are just honorable mention ones. But I think the first three that you hinted at, I think those would be, the big ones. And then I guess the other question would kind of be like, would Tatum be inarguably a top five guy if they were to win the title, or would it be more so like, okay, maybe he might be right below the top five where it's like 6, 7, but because his team is really good, it doesn't really matter that much.
I mean, it depends on if he plays well. Like if there's a if it's a finals where Jalen Brown looks like the best player on the floor, from the Celtics perspective, then I think there's a conversation to be had. Okay, Jalen Brown is the guy, because he's the one who helped deliver you a championship. But if it's Jason Tatum, then that begs the question. Okay, what are the stats going to look like? Is it going to be like his regular season stats where it's almost a, like 26-point triple double, or is it going to be more? Because I think you need a little bit more from him, elevation wise, if you really want to talk about him being a top five guy. Because that top five is stacked, bro. Like the
Right.
consensus is what it's like. It's
Luka,
Giannis.
Jokic, Giannis, Embiid, and I think SGA now is kind of
Yeah, like can
elevated.
you put Tatum in that top five? I think he's right outside of it. But like,
Right.
does a title really put you in the top 5 conversation based on your stats
Right.
and your impact? That would be my
Yeah, like
question.
Luka is already considered a top 5 player, and this is his first NBA
Well,
Finals,
yeah,
right?
his stats have been and have always
Yeah,
been insane. Like Tatum has never
exactly.
had the eye-popping stats where it makes you go, "Wow, okay." He's always had that team where the record is so good where you kind of wonder, "Okay, why isn't this guy top 3 in, MVP voting or whatever award you want to talk about?"
Right.
Um, I think it'll help his case all time and it'll help
Mhm.
rewrite the narrative on his career, but I don't
Right.
think it'll make him top 5
Because I
player
guess the question
currently.
is that who would you even take out? Because you'd have to replace, him
Yeah.
with somebody,
I mean,
and
maybe
it's like
Shea. I mean, but that's such a
right,
hard thing to do considering the counting stats for Shea. They were like through the roof, and what he was able to do and being the number 1 seed in
right.
the West is a big difference than being the number
And
1 seed in the East.
I think people don't view his supporting cast as the same as
No, you
Boston's,
saw
even
it in the
though those are good.
playoffs.
Even though they're good players, but they're not at the same point of their careers, right?
Yeah.
Like none of those guys other than SGA are, all-stars yet,
Yeah, what?
right?
J-Dub's in his
Especially
second year. Chet technically second year, first year though.
right, yeah, Giddy's in what, year 3,
Yeah, and I
and
don't
then
even think he wouldn't even be a starter on
no, no,
Boston,
y yeah, but I'm just saying, like, yeah, I think that's the big thing, so,
Yeah.
like yeah, and so it's like, if he wins the title, like you said, does it change where he ranks? Like, because there are some people that I think have him, like, 8, 9, 10, right? I think if
That's
he were
fine.
to win the title, I think you would have to probably have him at worst, like, 6, 7,
Yeah.
but but some people may make the argument kinda like you said, where it's like because the team is really good, like, we could just accept, like, yeah, he may not be a top 5 player, but he's good enough that he can still win you a title. And like you said, it may just be like you said, it may just affect his how people view him all time. Like
Yeah.
you said, and like, can you win a title with this guy as your best player, as opposed to like, oh, is he a top 5 guy now?
Like if he has a series where he's like an elite two-way player, which he's always been amazing on defense and offense, and I think that's kind of part of the reason why his counting stats take a hit, because he does a lot on the rebounding end of things. He does a lot playmaking. He carries the load, but not necessarily in the way that kind of the other top 5 guys would. If you look
Right.
at like a Giannis, where it's like it's clear that he's carrying Jokic, it's clear like SGA, clear like Tatum, it's more so like you've got like the Avengers on your team,
Right.
and you're maybe like Iron Man or Captain America. Like we know
Mhm.
that you have what it takes to be the best, but are you? Like that would be
Yeah.
my question because the problem is he's been
Mhm.
outshined by a lot of guys on his team
Right.
already and even like throughout his career already.
Mhm.
There was times when I think Kyrie outshined him. Jalen Brown has outshined him, the majority of their run together, um, and it's continued, and that's the problem I think. But
Yeah.
like, because
Yeah.
it just depends on what kind of series he has. Like,
Right.
we don't know. Like, it could be
Yeah.
a
I was
series where he averages like he could have like horrible numbers and he
right.
wins a title. That doesn't mean he's gonna be top 5.
Yeah, and like I was kind of listening, like to some people, kind
What's
of
up?
talking about some Tatum Celtic stuff, and like they thought about like what about say like an Embiid,
What about him?
I guess. Like I guess like could you put him ahead of Embiid? And I think they were arguing from the perspective of I guess availability, right? Where it's like I guess because Tatum generally plays like 70 plus games, and even though his numbers I guess aren't as good of Embiid's, but he may just be like a guy that you can rely on more.
I mean, I could put a lot of guys over Embiid, if we're going
Okay.
based on availability, and that's no like,
Yeah.
and that's me being unbiased. Like, I'm not an
But
Embiid guy, but
right.
yeah, if
But
we're
like
going off availability, yeah, I'd want Tatum on my team. But if we're going
okay.
by stats and impact on the game on a nightly
Okay.
basis, ideal situation, Embiid clears. Like bro, he was having one of the most dominant NBA seasons of all time.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, it just got derailed because of his lack of availability. Um,
Right.
but yeah, if the number one factor that we're talking about here, for why a guy should be in the top 5 is availability, then okay, yeah, we can move Joel Embiid out of there. But is that the only reason? I don't. People don't make the top 5 based on is this guy available. I think they
Right.
would make it more so on the impact alongside availability. Availability is
Yeah.
a factor, but I wouldn't say
I
that's the
think
number one driving factor for me
yeah,
making, a top five
I,
list. Because if
I
that's the
think
case, then it's completely different.
yeah, I think most people initially kind of just base it off of the talent. Like, is this person one of the 5 best players in the NBA, basically,
Right.
right? And I think, like you said, I think based off like the stats and the quote unquote impact or numbers or whatever, like you would still put Embiid, ahead of Tatum,
Yeah. 100%.
right? It's just yeah, it's just like you said. Once you add in other factors, like say like availability or something, then that's where, like you said, that may change who you would prefer to have. And I think there's a difference between like whether or not a player is better than one or the other versus like which player would you rather have. Kind of like how people will say like a player is more skilled than another player, but just because a player is more skilled doesn't necessarily mean that they're better,
Right.
right? So it's kind of like at a certain point it may be like kind of semantics or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and it's like the way that I look at Jason Tatum is, he's not a fan favorite. We all know that.
Yeah.
I think it's personally because he plays for the Celtics. If he played for any other team, people would probably be glazing him. But like the best analogy I can give you, I know there might be some Dragon Ball watchers, but Jason Tatum is kind of like Gohan. You saw him at a young age be phenomenal. You saw what he could be. He gets to that age where you're like, you should be peaking, and there's so much untapped potential. And I don't think it has anything to do with his work ethic or anything like that. It's just a
Right.
matter of, your game could be so much better. Not necessarily if you didn't have a super team, because I don't care what anybody says. This Boston team is a super team. Like these guys are amazing. Um, but I don't know. I just feel like it's more so he's overshadowed because he has a crazy supporting cast.
Yeah.
If it was more so
I
like Jason Tatum, Jalen Brown, and like some other guys like similar to the other rosters, and he turns
mhm,
up, then yeah, okay, we can have the conversation of top five for sure. But when you're
right.
on a team like this, no shot you're in the top five.
Yeah. I do think there's something to be said about like, yeah, if a guy like a Tatum, finds success early where like as a rookie he's in the conference finals and they're in a game 7, right? Then all of a sudden like the expectations are raised a lot more than like, say if like you're one of the top picks of the draft and your team stinks early on, right? Where it's
Sure.
like cuz usually when you're like a top 3 pick, you're probably not on a good team,
Yeah,
right?
look at Lonzo
Like
when he was picked number one or number two.
yeah, I think Fultz was the number 1 pick.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know why I said number one, but yeah.
Yeah, but either way, like yeah, like the expectations are just higher sometimes, like when your team is good really early, right?
Yeah.
Because then it's like, oh, okay, well, now we expect you to, to kind of do this stuff. Like say even with like a Edwards, right, where it's like, he's 22 and he ended up having a bad series, right? But again, we're not going to use, you shouldn't use that series as like, evidence that like, see, he can't be, this or that, or
Yeah.
whatever, right? Like, presumably he's only going to get better. And we've seen really great players have, bad series early on in their careers, right? Where like we kind of, where like, people are already kind of starting to write, like people were starting to write Giannis off, right? Like he had,
So stupid.
the series against, what was it, Toronto, right? Where they were able to kind of wall off the paint. And then, he had the series against the Heat where they beat him in 5, right? And nobody saw that coming, right?
Yep.
And then people were kind of starting to say, okay, he may be a Robin. He might be a guy where you have to, put another guy that's better than him next to him, in order to win a title,
The
right? And then the
recency
next, and
bias is crazy, bro.
right, and that's the other factor is like, when you see a guy do X, Y, and Z or not do X, Y, and Z, then that immediately is what pops into your head, and you're just kind of assuming that that's what it's always going to be. But it's not like these guys are 35, right? And they're pretty much kind of, locked into what they're probably going to be, right? These guys are, a guy like a Tatum is not even 30. So presumably he should only get better. And even if he doesn't, right, like it's still a really good player. So I think that's kind of where, some of that stuff, comes into play, right? Because that's just what happens. Like when you do that kind of stuff early on, right? Then people are kind of, expecting a I don't know, like just a natural level of progression where like, because like people would say like, oh, Eastern Conference Finals this year means, finals trip or championship this year. And sometimes it doesn't happen like that. Sometimes it's not necessarily linear because we've talked about the development of players, right? Where it's like sometimes a guy looks great in year 1, takes a step back in year 2, then has an awesome year 3. Sometimes a guy, is rough in year 1 and then gets better each year. And then sometimes some guys peak and then sometimes some guys just progressively get better and better until they can't get better anymore.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different pathways, and I think he has gotten better, pretty much every year. So I think that's kind of, what you look at, right? Like the Celtics wouldn't be, a championship roster, if I think if Tatum wasn't at least as, good as he is, right? Like if he was like a top 25 or 30 player, like they probably wouldn't necessarily be quite good enough to win the title. They still may be good enough to make deep playoff runs, but probably not good enough to win the championship because you need somebody I think like that can at least play like a top five player on given nights, right? Like, because that's kind of the main thing, right? And then maybe that's just because there's more talent around the league.
Hmm.
So maybe more guys can kind of get away with being the best player on, a championship level team, maybe, right? But I think that's kind of the main thing, right? Because I mean, like, and it's not like the same comparison, but like say like a Steph, right? Like there were people where you know, after he won the fourth title, right, was when they started giving him like, even more flowers and props, right? Because, say, obviously he had won the first title, right? But then there were some people that were like, oh, he had Durant, and Durant might have been the best player on those two teams. So like even though he won three titles, right, like it was really one or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, but
What kind of argument? I mean, like I know what you're talking about. I've heard it
right,
before, and every time I hear that kind of argument where you're trying to erase somebody's titles, like, are you
right,
serious? We could even talk about the bubble title, where it's like people try and erase the Lakers title because it was the bubble.
right.
What? Like, no,
Yeah,
bro. Like at the end of the day, it's just NBA history. It's just
right,
how the ball rolls, bro. Like, and that's the crazy part about the finals. Like, yeah, we could have a series where Jason Tatum is the worst player on the Boston Celtics during the entire finals. Is that likely to happen? Probably not, but it
right.
could. Like, there's
Yeah.
don't sleep on the fact
And
that Jalen Brown could be the best player for the Celtics the
And
entire
like
series.
and again, like there is a scenario where Tatum doesn't have like a dominant finals, but they still win.
Yeah,
And so,
does nothing
where
for
it's
his
like
legacy in terms of being a top five guy.
right, but say like for Dallas, is it likely that Luca doesn't have a dominant finals and they win?
No, you need him
Like
to,
probably
bro.
not.
You
Like,
need him to be the best player on the floor, and that's what's going to happen. If he is the best player on the floor alongside Kyrie Irving, boom, give them the trophy right there.
right. So again, and then, that's kind of the outlook, for over the course of, this game and, presumably right the rest of the series as well. Obviously, like, each game is kind of a chess match in and of itself, right? Like sometimes the stuff that worked in one game doesn't necessarily work in the other game,
Sure.
right? Sometimes, we have players that have certain performances in one game, right? Where it's like, say like Al Horford comes out and hits like 7 threes in game one, right? And then
Sure.
in game two, he's like 0 for 4 or like 0 for 6 or something like that, right? Say like, I don't know, like a Luka Doncic, right? Shoots like 8 for 26 in game one,
Okay.
right? But then like in game two, he might shoot, like 15 for 24 or something like that,
Yeah.
right? Like these kind of things can happen, right? So, a lot of times the adjustments are kind of within the games themselves. Obviously, there's game to game adjustments as well. And then sometimes, like, even the mental aspects, right? Where it's like, let's say, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, right? But, like, let's say, Dallas wins game one, right? Well, then realistically, you might assume that Boston in game two is going to come out, you know, with a lot more, emotion and with a lot more effort than whatever happened in game one because they don't want to lose game two at home and then be down 0-2.
Yeah.
Whereas, and again, not saying that this is 100% the case, but same like maybe Dallas is not quite as, aggressive in game two because they're like, we got the first game. So,
That's all that mattered to them
yeah, that's all that matters,
at
right?
that point.
So like, yeah, exactly. And sometimes that's what happens, right? Over the course of a series.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, like, again, we expect this to be a really good finals, right? I think, we both have the Celtics winning this series in six, but I think we've made the case, for both teams, right? Like we believe that the Mavs can win this series. We just believe that the Celtics are the better team and we think they will win this series. But I wouldn't say I would be, completely shocked or flabbergasted if Dallas, were to pull this off because they do have the best player. It's just a scenario where I do think Boston's team is better in terms of the talent, even on both ends of the floor. And I think that may be tough, for Dallas to overcome, even if Luca does have a great series. Because I think there's also a world where like Luca could play really, 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 really well. and Dallas could still lose because of the fact that, you know, because of the fact, that maybe some other guys don't play quite as well, or maybe Boston, is just kind of too much for Dallas to stop.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I
I think
agree with
that's
that.
kind of, some important things to look at.
Yeah, I agree.
So now I guess, we kind of already talked about, I think, what we think, is going to happen like in terms of predictions for game 1. I think we're kind of like on opposite ends of the spectrum, even though we both think that Boston will win the series. I just feel, like I just think like there is a world where Dallas could steal it, but I think also like, with the Porzingis feeling pretty good, that may, lean it more towards Boston. I think we both expected him to play anyways. It's just, again, if it's kind of a certainty, maybe that means he might physically be, better than what some people are expecting. And again, like, when you look at the Vegas odds, they got Boston as 6.5 point favorites, which, is relatively solid, right?
Yeah,
Like, it's not like they're only like 2 point favorites or something. Like, because again, like double digit favorites in a finals is kind of not normal unless it's a scenario where there's a team that's clearly significantly better than the other, which,
like last year,
it's been a while. Huh?
like last year.
Yeah, exactly. Like I don't even remember what Miami was like what the odds were in game 1. Though the last time I can remember like ridiculous odds, I think it was 2018 where it was Cavs and Warriors game 1, and I think, the Cavs were like double digit underdogs. They were like at least like 12-point underdogs, and that ended up being, like a game that went into overtime.
Yeah,
Um so but I mean like either way, I guess like it should be a fun game, right? And it should be a fun series, right? Like you said, and like I said, I don't think we expected the Mavs to be here, but I think, getting here in a very tough Western Conference is quite an accomplishment. And like I said, I don't necessarily know if it ends in a championship, but I wouldn't sleep or overlook on Dallas because I do think that they have the ability to get it done. I
yeah,
just feel like the Celtics are better. And again, that was my preseason pick, to win the title because I liked, the moves that they made. Because initially, like when it was just Porzingis, not that I didn't love it, but I wasn't as high on it. But then when they had him and Holiday, particularly in terms of like who they gave up to get him, I'm like, yeah, that's
yeah,
the team in the.
and
And I
and
don't think that's like, a hot take or anything. I think most people were pretty high on what Boston did. I know there were people that thought it might be the Bucks, or maybe some people had, held out some hope for Philly or something like that. But
yeah. I mean, and that I think the comment that we read at the beginning of the video kind of solidifies what people are talking about. Where okay, yeah, Boston is the favorite, but Luka Magic is a thing. Kyrie is a thing as well. Like these guys are they're legit, and I think it's scary. It's a scary combination for Boston, and I don't think Boston should be, you know, content with facing this team because like we talked about, there is a roadmap for them to not squash the Celtics, but get past them for sure and win the title.
yeah. So now, kind of moving on into, I guess, some news and rumors, right? So, according to Mark Stein, right, he's got some things here, right? Tibbs is a quote unquote virtual certainty to get big extension, right? Knicks head coach is in a great position to get new deal at the market rate, right? And I think that makes sense, right? Obviously, they've been for the most part better every year, right, under him, right? And obviously they've kind of established a culture there, and I think he's part of that culture. Obviously, you can talk about, maybe he runs guys into the ground with the heavy minutes. But I also, again, like I think he's a good coach, and it's like what we've talked about before. It's like it's not really anybody on the market where I'm like I'd rather have, this guy than Tom, Thibodeau, right? Like I mean, it's like would I rather have Micah Nori or David Adelman over Tom Thibodeau? Like maybe, but probably not. So and I think again, like keeping your coach when he's like a solid coach makes a lot of sense because like if you're the Knicks, you've built up a culture. You don't want to necessarily like all of a sudden kind of just like tear it down and like make like these major changes to it, unless it's like more along the lines of like bringing in some other talent like on the roster.
Yeah, and we talked about it multiple times where the culture was not the culture didn't just appear overnight. It's been built for as long as Tibbs has been there. Even through the dark times when it was Tibbs and Julius Randle. But then adding Jalen Brunson was kind of the piece that put you over the hump, where it's like, okay, this is another guy that adds to our culture as well. And then bringing in guys like Dante DiVincenzo, just other guys who fit the mold. You can't get rid of their coach because as much as he seems to be, one of the least favorite coaches in the NBA, especially through these polls and stuff, you can't ignore that, his methods have results, and we've seen it before, and we're definitely seeing it in New York.
Yeah. Another Mark Stein rumor. Darvin Ham passed on joining Sun staff. Coach Bud wanted former Lakers head coach to join his staff in Phoenix. So what do we think about that, right? According to Mark Stein, Mike Budenholzer, quote unquote, made a run at trying to convince him to join his staff. But he understandably passed after 2 exacting seasons in Lakerland. So I guess I don't know if that means that he's kind of taking a break or maybe he's waiting for a different opportunity, right? I know that there was kind of like a thought process of maybe Golden State adds him, but that didn't happen. So do you think he ends up getting another, like maybe assistant gig, right? Like probably I don't necessarily know if it's another head coaching gig, but I think he could still probably be on somebody's staff. I just don't necessarily know if it's going to be, like right away.
I think he wants a head coaching job. If you want me to be honest, that's kind of how I feel.
Okay. Right.
Maybe in a place where there's not as many eyes, but problem is a lot of these vacancies, they filled up pretty quickly.
Mhm.
And there's every single place that the only one that everybody really cares about is the Lakers, and we already know he wouldn't be coming back. That would make absolutely no sense. But
Right. Yeah.
yeah, I foresee him either wanting a head coach job and he doesn't get it, which kind of results in a break.
Hmm.
Because I think that would have been a smart reunion, I guess. Because I think they did have some success when they were down there in Atlanta.
Hmm.
They bolstered a really good record and they had a bunch of all stars one year. But at the end of the day, I think he has to kind of sit and let all this stuff pass over his head because there was a lot of mistakes that I think that he made throughout his run as a head coach, and I think
Hmm.
people aren't willing to just overlook those just yet, due to the fact that they didn't really find a whole lot of success with him at the helm. Um, but I do understand it. Like if I was him, I would want a head coaching job too because like I don't want to go back to what I was doing beforehand.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because he was already an assistant coach for a while.
Hmm.
So, but he may have to wait a little bit longer, right? Because, like you said, now there's not as many spots available, right? Like, like Mike Brown, right? Like, which I guess we can kind of mention, right? He was, now they gave him his new extension, right? Which, I think we were kind of thinking that at a certain point it needed to happen, right? Because of the fact that, again, like we said, I don't think it was necessarily his fault that the Kings kind of underperformed this year, right? Like
Right.
maybe he had somewhat to do with it, but like if you were doing a blame pie, I think he would have a smaller portion of it, right? I think it had more to do with the roster was, you know, not really it wasn't really any better than the previous season's roster and a bunch of teams around the West got better. And then obviously the Kings were able to stay healthy for most of previous season, but this season they got hurt at the end and it ended up costing them, right? They're going to have the 13th pick in the draft, so either they use it to bring in somebody in the rotation or they trade it. But, I think you needed to bring him back, right? Because it's just like I think again like him being there, I think, again it's a 3-year $30 million deal, so that puts him closer to the top in terms of higher paid coaches. But I mean, it made sense, right? Because I think he's done a good job, and I think he's done a good job of, kind of putting together a more serious culture, right? When that wasn't the case for Sacramento, for a really long time, right? They had like a couple of okay stretches, but prior to that, right, it was looking kind of rough.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but now going on to Philadelphia, right? So there are a couple of stories there, right, from the Philadelphia Inquirer, right? Sixers want role players back, right? Interested in re-signing Kyle Lowry, Kelly Oubre, Nick Batum. I mean, that's probably relatively fine, right? Like Lowry and Batum are probably, if I had to guess, like minimum contract type guys
Hmm.
or close to it, right? Oubre probably worth more than a minimum, but they have a ton of cap, so he could probably get like 8 million or something like that. And I'm just kind of spitballing, but like he could get an amount that like Philly could probably still pay, and then probably still have enough to sign other guys, right? Because they also mentioned that there are 4 stars that they're targeting, right? And the 4 names that have been mentioned include Paul George, LeBron James, Jimmy Butler, and Brandon Ingram. So, I guess first off, kind of tell me your thoughts on, the minimum guys. And then after that, which I think I'm assuming that's going to be a short discussion. And then after that, like of those 4 guys, stars mentioned, which one do you think is the best, fit? But also, I guess, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the most realistic to get, but we'll
I
see.
mean, I like I like the role players. I think that's a great start. You have to start somewhere. And bringing back
Mhm.
those guys, like you talk about Batum, I think that's a great addition. He had some heroic moments, but he also had some moments where you're like, okay, yeah, can't pay this guy a whole lot of money. Um,
Mhm.
and then same with Oubre, where it's like, okay, yeah, amazing. He helped you a lot during the regular season, helped you even in the postseason a little bit, especially during some matchups where you felt like, okay, they might be at a disadvantage here, but his length and his ability to defend and do a little bit of creation on the offensive end definitely helped you win some games that you probably shouldn't and wouldn't have won without him. So I like those, things. But as for the stars, LeBron, I think, is out of the question. I don't think, you're getting LeBron. I don't think he would want to go to Philly. Not at this point in his career, no shot. Um, Paul George, I think that's probably the most intriguing one. That's the one that has, I think, the most hype around it,
Mhm.
a lot of attention drawn to it. We've already addressed this, I think, a gajillion times where, if you're Paul George, you really want to go to Philly because is that situation that much better? Yes, you'll be in the Eastern Conference that's weaker. But at the end of the day, are you and Joel Embiid going to be, ready to go 100% or as close to 100% as you can be for the playoffs, or else you're just going to be dealing with a whole nother Paul George and Kawhi situation where one or both of you guys aren't healthy come playoff time, and that's just going to derail your process even further, and you're not going to find any success there. Um, I'd be intrigued by Brandon Ingram potentially, but I don't know. It's tough. I think Philly, they have like one of the best situations
Mhm.
for this offseason, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily the greatest free agency class. We've talked about that. Um, and if you're trading for somebody, you're probably going to need to not give up a king's ransom, but give up a little bit more than you would probably want to.
Yeah, I mean for them because they don't have a lot of free agents, or I mean not free agents because they won't have a lot of players on the roster going into free agency because a lot of them are free agents.
Mm-hmm.
If they're trading for a guy, it's probably a scenario where it's just going to be like picks and they're absorbing it, into their cap space, right? Like if they're
Right.
getting Jimmy Butler, it would have like they don't have anybody that they could probably realistically aside from like I don't know like if it was like hey Miami you want Paul Reed or somebody like that like they don't have a lot of guys that will be under contract I don't think on the
Right.
roster going into free agency. So I mean like you said we've already talked about it, right? Like you said LeBron, I just don't see it happening. I think he just ends up going back to LA. um and then you know and then after that, Butler, George, Ingram. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's like, George is a free agent, so it's like you don't have to give up anything in order to get him. It's just a matter of like you said, like I mean, I guess Philly
Take the
is
swing,
probably
though.
better. Huh?
Take the swing. If you're Philly,
Yeah.
offer.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's like you can offer Miami, it's just and we talked about this on the Miami Heat Zone podcast where it's like, what does Miami want to do, right? Because we know that's the other thing, like say with Butler, right? Like he wants that extension, the 2-year, $113 million extension. And, oftentimes, like when we see the stars, being traded, it's usually a scenario where it's like, I'm not going to resign and stay here, so you need to trade me before I'm a free agent.
Hmm.
But in the Heat's case, it could possibly be, we don't want to sign you to the extension, so we're going to get rid of you,
Right, right, right.
um, or something like that, right? So, like, if you're Philly and you're going to trade for him and give him that extension, it's like, okay, because once you do that, right, then there's going to be a point where he may not be the same guy. And if you're locked into paying like Joel a ton of money, Maxi a ton of money, and Jimmy Butler a ton of money, how else are you going to be able to put stuff together on the margin? Especially again, like Butler already misses a decent amount of time, Embiid misses a decent amount of time, and that's probably not going to change because both guys are 30 plus, both very good players, right? But that's where like that one may be the biggest gamble, right? Even more so than like the Paul George one. So that's the interesting part, and like I don't know, like I guess like yeah, you're probably better if you have Paul George or Jimmy Butler than if you have Tobias Harris or whatever else was on Philly's roster.
Right.
But again, I guess like you said, for George, is it this situation going to be that different? I guess for like Miami, like for Butler, like you probably have a better chance of contending if you're on Philly than if you're in Miami. But again, it's just like if I'm Philly, like I don't know, like I mean, like, if he wants to do it, I guess you can take the swing. It's just so risky. And then, like, with Ingram, I guess that's the one where it's like, he's younger than those guys. So presumably he would have more high level years left. But,
Mm.
again, like,
Fit
he's,
wise, though, I don't know.
Yeah, like fit wise, I think that one is the strangest one of all. Because like even with Butler, where it's kind of a weird fit, like he's still like a good defender, and other stuff like that. Whereas like Ingram, I guess has gotten better on defense, but he's like I'd still rather have Paul George or Jimmy Butler defensively, even though those guys I don't think are quite as good on defense as they were before. They're still better on defense than Ingram. And then with Ingram, like he's more of an ISO scorer. Like I think George is the easiest guy to plug in and play, right? And then like Butler is kind of like the one where it's like he's probably more talented, but probably a little bit more difficult to fit in there. And
Sure.
then Ingram is like the wild card one where it's like we're just banking on like this guy is still young and quote unquote improving. And but then it's like if you're New Orleans, right? Like I don't think you would just want picks for Ingram
No.
because that's another situation where it's like again, like you're absorbing him into your cap space. But I would assume that could possibly be like a 3-team trade or something like that. But if it's a 3-team trade, then that's a more difficult um, you know, trade machine type thing. Like that's a lot more difficult to put together than just a
Yeah,
two-team
it's going
trade.
to be a
But
longer process. It's going to drag on for longer as well. And the third team is possibly going to rotate in and out.
right, yeah, but yeah, I don't know. Like the Ingram one, I hadn't even really thought about. So,
Me
but
neither.
like, but that is a name obviously that's been thrown around in a lot of trade rumors. It's just Philly wouldn't have been at the top of my mind. I remember like I think like in 2K I was doing like a thing where I think I ended up sending him to Atlanta, right? Where it
Yeah,
was like
that's
a
what
trade,
everybody's been talking about.
right? Because it was like Trey Young, going to New Orleans, but who knows? Like, but
Yep.
and then also Giannis to play for Greek team, right? So kind of an interesting scenario, right, where he wasn't available for the postseason, but he will be available for the Olympics, and I don't think he's the only guy, right? Like Kawhi's supposedly going to play in the Olympics,
Yep.
so that's another factor,
Yeah, it's awesome.
as well. You said what?
So that's awesome.
Right. So, again, we'll see, right? Obviously, the Olympics, there's going to be, the American roster is going to be seemingly pretty talented, right?
Sure.
Obviously, if Giannis plays for the Greek team, right, that can help raise their ceiling, right? And if some other guys play for their native places, right, that also can make things more interesting as well. But it just is kind of interesting because that like obviously there's people kind of going around, at the fact that they're not very happy with the fact that he couldn't play at all in the playoffs, but he's going to be able to play in the Olympics. And again, that's the unfortunate thing about injuries. But again, like it's not a scenario where it's like Bucks fans may be unhappy about it, or maybe fans of other teams may be unhappy about it. But it's like if you're the Bucks, you're not saying like, all right, that's it, we're done with this guy. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So, but it's kind of an interesting. And then also asking price for Zach Levine has quote unquote dropped significantly, right? We haven't talked about this guy in a while, right? But this is a guy where prior to that trade deadline, right, he was named a lot, right? Because of the fact that he is a talented player. But the problem is that he's got a lot of injury issues. And also he makes a lot of money,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's kind of the biggest issue, right? Is the contract, right? It's kind of like what we talked about with Trey Young, right? Where it's like it's a guy that's a good player that could probably help a lot of teams. But it's just you have to give up so much in order to get those guys. And especially like for Levine, right? Like I don't think he's in the same tier as a Trey Young. So I think the question for him is like if you're trading for him, he's basically one of your 2 or 3 main guys, and then like that's it. And
Right.
so it's like unless you're a team that just has like a boatload of salary to just kind of throw, just to kind of like throw to Chicago. Because if that's the case, right, like Casey Johnson is saying of NBC Sports Chicago, if that's the case where like his asking prices drop significantly to the point where they may have to kind of just trade him and just kind of just get kind of like junk back, right? But then the question would be like, what team is there that just has junk that they could just give to the Bulls for Levine? You know what I mean? Like, what team would that necessarily be? Because we talked about teams, during the deadline, but none of those trades materialized, right? Like, the Lakers were mentioned, but I don't think you nor I thought that would have been a good idea for the Lakers, and they didn't do it. And he got hurt anyways, right? There was some Detroit buzz, which was kind of random, but again, I think him getting hurt probably put the squash on the trade talks, but they're going to come back up again because presumably he'll be ready to play next season. And so again, the Levine saga continues, right? So it's like, is it possible he could get traded at the like on draft night or like in the free agency or like does he even get traded at all? Because it seems like if you're the Bulls, like you probably would want to move on from him,
Yeah.
and it's not even that he's bad. It's just it's probably better to kind of like reset the decks a little bit so that way you can just kind of, because you already have some guys now that in like say Lonzo and Levine's absence is right. Like now there are other guys that have kind of come up, right? Where it's like Kobe White was a bench player and now he's a really good starter.
Yeah.
So, maybe so a guy like, like Alonzo, may be a little bit more expendable, right? Or even like a Levine may be a little bit more expendable now. So, now you can kind of like focus on, like I said, reshuffling and kind of just, I don't know. Cause like Chicago's weird because it's like they could still end up re-signing DeRozan and kind of run the play-in team back, right? Run back the mid three. But, like, is that the correct decision? Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, what did they really get out of, what they ended up doing? Because again, it's like it's fine to play for something, but I don't know. Like I guess like start there, right? So it's like if you're the Bulls, like, are you basically like we need to trade Zach Levine, and then like what do you do after that?
I mean, yeah, I would trade Zach Levine, but I don't foresee him really getting traded probably into the deadline.
Okay.
Because I think people need to see what he is, at least a glimpse of it. We're not
Hmm.
gonna know. I mean, I think most people know what he's going to be, but what is he really gonna look like coming off another injury? That would
Hmm.
be the big question. It's just that
Foot injury too.
yeah, exactly. That contract is like the big killer though. Um,
Hmm.
but Chicago, they'll have potentially Lonzo Ball back. You'll have Kobe White, you'll have some good pieces, but not enough to contend. Even if you do bring back, everybody. If Chicago's healthy, there's probably a potential for them to be better than they were last year,
Yeah.
but not to the point where it's like a team that I would kind of want to continue with long term, if that makes sense. I would kind of want to break it up, get back some assets, get back some pieces,
Hmm.
and kickstart the rebuild. That it's time. The team didn't win anything. They're not going to win anything as currently constructed. Move on, get some better pieces, and you have a crazy draft. A couple of crazy drafts coming up. You got the Boozer twins. You've got Cooper Flag, Ace Bailey. Nita go on.
Right.
You've got a lot of potential prospects coming in. You can always
Yeah.
trade, and build through that. But yeah, start
Right.
getting rid of guys that probably don't have a place where you don't have a place
Yeah.
for them on your team.
And I think that's probably the case where, to make for like, okay, where it's like it's okay to not be as bad this year, but say like next year because the draft, like you said, is so much better,
Yeah.
right? That's a year where it's like you would probably prefer to be bad. Because it's like if you look at the East, is it realistic to expect the Bulls to be in the same tier of like, the top eight, right? Where it's like Boston, New York, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Orlando, Indiana, Philly, Miami, right? Like
Probably
that's
not.
yeah, like
They're
probably
play-in
not. Like maybe
territory again.
yeah, like maybe one of those teams takes a step back, right? Like let's say like if Cleveland makes some big changes, maybe they take a step back, or like let's say if Miami moves on from Butler, maybe they take a step back. But like even then, like you're still not really in that upper tier of teams in the Eastern Conference. So,
Yeah.
it's like if you're not in that tier, you might as well kind of move down to the bottom tier. But then it's like at the same time with the group of players they have, they're not bad enough to be all the way at the bottom. Like they're not bad enough to be Charlotte or Detroit,
Right.
Washington. So like and that's where like you said, that's where you need to kind of commit and make like an actual decision about what you want to do, right? Like either commit to this mediocre team and be mediocre, which I guess they've done, or commit to like a rebuild.
Yeah. And it's like, take it from me, a Wizards fan. There's nothing worse than being stuck in that infinite loop of mediocrity. It'll get you nowhere, and either commit to being really, really good or commit to being really, really goddamn bad. It's either or. You can't be stuck in the middle.
Yeah. Couple of last, Yahoo Sports rumors, right? I guess from, Jake Fisher, right? So we got three, I guess, right? So Nick Claxton likely to get 80 to 100 million, expected to extend, stay in Brooklyn amid free agency. I think we expect him to come back. It's just a matter of, what the cost was going to be, right? He had a good season. It's just going to be interesting from Brooklyn's perspective, where it's like, you're paying multiple guys, close to 100 million, and they're all kind of in similar ish tiers, right? But maybe that makes it possible, maybe that makes it possible to maybe move one of those guys like Bridges or, Johnson or somebody like that down the line. But,
Mm-hmm.
it's a weird roster, right? And then obviously, you factor in the Simmons, his contract as well, right? Where it's like probably can't trade that.
Mm-mm.
But, again, like it's just weird because it's like I don't feel like he's a $100 million player, but like at the same time, like I guess if you're Brooklyn, it's like you can't really let him just walk. because then, you lost, a good player for nothing.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, like it doesn't feel great to pay him that much, but he is a good defender, he's a good rebounder, so and again, like, it's better that to keep the asset, so then worst case scenario you can trade them down the line versus just losing them for nothing. And I think that's like look at Portland with Jeremy Grant, where it's like, do you really want to give Jeremy Grant like a 5-year max deal?
No.
Probably not. But there may be a way down the line where a team may want him, and then you have him, and you can get something back from him in a trade,
Yeah.
as opposed to a scenario where it's like you just you got him, and then you get nothing for him if he leaves.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense if you want me to be honest, but I
Yeah,
don't know. Brooklyn's
yeah.
weird, bro.
Right. So Cavs not very motivated to break up court. Team currently not listening to offers for Mitchell, Garland, Allen, or Mobley. Right. So according to Jake Fisher, the Cavs don't appear very motivated to listen to offers of their core four. Do you believe this?
No, I don't believe it at
Oh,
all. With Rich Paul and them talking about Darius Garland being potentially moved, I think they're talking behind the scenes for sure. I think they're just kind of quieting things down. But I think it'll not resurface. I think it'll resurface maybe post draft.
hmm
Um, I'm thinking it'll probably resurface around the deadline, especially if the team is kind of like mid or not working or somebody's hurt, or somebody's just not happy. But also, they're gonna have to get a new coach. And I mean, I don't know. What do we think of that? Like
right.
that's a
I mean,
factor. Like what is the
right.
coach gonna look like? What is the team gonna look like? What's the new structure gonna look
Yeah.
like? Are they gonna
Is
make
the team
adjustments? You know?
right? Is the team significantly better with that coach in place? Like, I mean, it's probably not going to be that much different unless you get a big jump, from like Mobley or Garland has like a bounce back year or something like that. And then obviously, first we have to see the Mitchell extension, right? Because Cleveland
Yeah.
has to offer it to him at 200 million or so, which we assume they will, and then it's
Yeah.
up to him to decide whether or not he wants to sign it. Because then if he
Yeah.
doesn't, then that's where you have to trade him.
Yeah.
Um, but then obviously if he does, sign it, then, worst case scenario, you get to at least have him for a while, right? Where it's like maybe he asks out later, right? As opposed to, right there and then.
If he
But I
signs
think
that
that's kind of
extension though, like
yeah.
expect Garland to
That's
be gone, I think.
that's the first domino, I think. The first domino is they have to offer it to him. Then he has to choose whether or not he signs it or not. Because if he doesn't, then that's where, a lot of things change.
Yeah.
And then also for Jake Fisher, last one, right? Hartenstein may command 100 million. So Knicks can offer a 4-year, $72.5 million deal in free agency. So I guess that's the max, that they can offer him, based off of what they can do. But he could possibly get more than that, right? 80 million, possibly upwards of 100, right? So given the Knicks salary cap situation, their best chance to keep him may be to utilize his early bird rights, but the best they can offer him is 4 years, 72.5 million, which could open the door for other teams to potentially land him. So I guess the question is, like one, do we expect him to get 100 million plus, 80 to 100 million? Um, or I guess two, do you expect him to be a Nick next season?
Nick, all the way. Um,
Okay.
I think we talked about it when the Knicks got eliminated. Run it back.
Mm,
And get healthy. I want to see that team at full strength, fully healthy. Obviously a lot of their deadline acquisitions were hurt, but then you'll have Julius Randle be back. Jalen Brunson will be fully healthy. I want to see that team. I think they can make it far and a lot farther than people probably think,
mhm.
especially in the East. We're not talking about the Western Conference here, so not saying it'll be a cakewalk, but if they can get to the Eastern Conference Finals next year with that team, I believe that they could. If fully
Right.
healthy. So run it back.
Yeah, I think he'll be back too. I mean, I guess, you look around, at the teams with cap space, right? And it looks like it's the Hornets, the Spurs, the Jazz, right? Uh well no. It's like the Hornets, I think the Pistons, right? OKC I think is the other team, right, that's going to have, cap space as well, right? Detroit, Philly, Orlando, Utah, OKC, and then Spurs, Charlotte, right? But Charlotte, again, they have to kind of, I think, decide what they want to do with some of those contracts, right? Before they get, more cap space.
I
But
wouldn't
it's
spend my
like
money on Hardenstein.
right, and then, like, so that's the thing, like, they're gonna have to spend money on somebody. It's just if you're any of those teams, do you spend like, if you're Philly, you don't spend that on Hartenstein,
No.
right? Because you have Embiid,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, you might get a backup center, right? But you're probably not paying $80 million to a backup center. Which like yeah, you're probably not paying 20 million a year to a backup center.
No.
Um, Utah, I don't think they do that. I mean, because they already have a couple of bigs on the roster. OKC maybe, but I don't know because I have no idea what they do with their cap space because they could possibly swing for somebody better, right? And they end up trading and absorbing somebody into cap. Spurs, they only have like 21, right? And they don't need to use it on Hartenstein. So, that's the thing. Like, and then Orlando has cap space, but I don't think they're going to use it on a center. So I think so that's where I feel like there may be some teams that might, I think this could be like an Austin Reeves type scenario where like we hear that like teams are going to offer him a lot, but then nobody actually does. And then,
Yeah, I don't
Hartenstein
think
ends
there's a
up going
market
back.
for it.
Yeah, like I don't know. I would have like I buy the fact that like a lot of teams like him and would like to have him on their team, like, but I don't necessarily I just feel like there's other guys that are going to be signed and then he probably just ends up going back to New York. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm kind of with you. I think he's a next season.
Yeah,
And
100%.
it's also like if you're New York, you can't really let him go
No.
because if you do, then your only other bigs are basically like Mitchell Robinson and Jericho Sims.
Yeah.
Like, and I just, and again, like Robinson's fine, but he's also kind of an injury risk where it's like he's just, he's never really healthy. And I think you'd like to have more than one option. And there's no real option, there's no real reason to let Hartenstein walk. Unless, like I said, it's a scenario where he gets paid more and you just literally can't afford to, you get outbid. But
Yeah.
I just don't think that's going to happen. I think there's going to be other players that are going to be targeted and paid in free agency before he is. Like, you know what I mean? Like, say, like Brooke Lopez last year, right? Like, a lot of people thought he might leave and get, big money from somewhere else, but he ended up just going back to Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, as we mentioned at the beginning, right, we were featured on Miami Heat Zone's podcast, right, the other day. So, check that out, right? Link in the description, right? Obviously, also the NBA Finals, right? They'll be underway on June 6th, Thursday, right? So, obviously, we're going to have a live stream, after that game. So, be sure to, tune in and check that out. Hang out with us so we can talk about the game, right? And then, obviously, again, continue to follow us on socials, continue to like, these videos for the algorithms, right? Also subscribe, right? And so hopefully either we see you, in the live streams or we see you in the next episode.